All right, so today we're diving into a topic that's causing a lot of debate these days, transracialism. And we've got kind of a hodgepodge of sources here.
Yeah.
Some from Wikipedia entries on ethnicity and race, um, even a TikTok video commenting on race, and some YouTube videos, too, about transgender identity and
Really interesting.
that concept of woke.
Yeah.
So some of these sources provide some historical context, I think, for how we think about race and ethnicity. But I think the real focus of this deep dive is going to be on this present-day debate that's being sparked by individuals who are claiming what they call transracial identities.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how this has really captured the public attention, like this collision between evolving ideas about identity and then like these really deeply rooted understandings of what race is and what belonging means.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like everybody has an opinion on it.
Yeah.
To kind of get a handle on things, I thought maybe we could start with the basics. And like the Wikipedia entry on ethnicity, for example, breaks down how we define different groups, based on stuff like language or nationality, physical traits, religion, even just like a shared culture.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating is how all of these categories intertwine. They're all sort of overlapping in some ways. And it really creates this complex idea of what belonging means.
Mhm.
Take the example of the Armenian example from that Wikipedia entry. Being Armenian can be connected to your citizenship in Armenia. The heritage that's passed down through generations speaking the Armenian language or even adhering to the Armenian Apostolic Church.
Right.
It's not just one thing.
Right, and that makes you wonder how somebody could, like, choose to become a part of another ethnicity or race. I mean, it's not like picking your favorite color.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the heart of the controversy around transracialism, and critics and especially transracial adoptees, they argue that claiming a racial identity that's different from your ancestry is a form of appropriation. It's like a fundamental misunderstanding of what race represents.
Yeah, that makes sense. You can't just, like, adopt a culture you admire, like a new fashion trend or something. There's this deep-rooted history and lived experience that comes with belonging to a particular racial group, especially groups that have faced, like, generations of oppression.
Right, and that's where things get even more complicated when we start to look at the concept of race itself.
Mhm.
The Wikipedia entry on race calls it out as a controversial topic right at the very beginning. On the one hand, you have this geneticist, David Wright,
Right.
who's arguing that the differences in genetic ancestry, which often align with, these racial categories,
Yeah.
they are real.
Right.
But then,
But then you have other scientists who are saying, well, hold on a second. The meaning we give to those genetic differences is completely shaped by social forces.
Okay.
It's not about denying that genetic variations exist.
right.
It's about challenging the significance that we assign to those variations.
Exactly. And that's where this concept of race as a social construct comes in.
Right.
The Wikipedia entry highlights this with a quote that I thought was really, really interesting. It says, "The commonalities and physical traits comprise part of the race concept. This linkage is a social distinction rather than an inherently biological one."
Yeah.
So, it's a really powerful statement, I think, that underscores how societal forces, not just biology, are shaping our understanding of race.
So where does this whole Rachel Dolezal thing fit into all of this?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, her story really blew up and kind of became like this focal point in this whole transracialism debate.
Yeah, Dolezal's case is like the prime example of why this is so controversial. So to give you a quick rundown, she's a woman who was born white but presented herself as black for years, and even became the head of a local NAACP chapter.
The NAACP. Wow.
Exactly. And that's what really fueled the firestorm.
Right.
Critics saw her actions as like a complete mockery of Black identity, a blatant disregard for like the historical and social realities of what it means to be Black in America.
Right. It's like she was trying to cherry pick aspects of Black culture, but without acknowledging the very real struggles
Right.
come with it.
And that gets to the core of the criticism against transracialism. A lot of people, especially transracial adoptees, see this as a slap in the face. They say you can't simply choose to be a part of a race that you weren't born into. It really diminishes that shared history, the cultural nuances and the lived experiences that define racial identity.
It's like saying, I admire your culture, so I'm going to adopt it as my own, but without fully understanding like the weight and the complexity that comes with it.
And that's what makes this debate so challenging. It forces us to confront these really fundamental questions about identity, about belonging, and the meaning of race in a society that's still grappling with its own legacy of racial injustice.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop for now, and we'll pick it up in part 2.
And it really kind of raises the question, can you really separate race from the lived experience of a racial group.
Right.
Can you truly understand what it means to be Black or Asian or Latinx if you haven't actually lived that reality?
That's a good question, and I think that's where this whole argument for transracialism seems to hit a wall. We're seeing a lot more acceptance these days of gender identity as fluid and independent of biological sex, but that same logic applied to race just faces this huge pushback.
Exactly. It's a false equivalency. The rejection of transracialism really centers on this idea that it trivializes the very real and often traumatic experiences that are tied to race. It's not just about how you feel on the inside. It's about generations of shared history and cultural traditions and, yeah, systemic oppression, too.
Right. It makes you think about like the perspective of transracial adoptees,
Yeah.
which is actually highlighted in some of our sources here.
Right.
And they often express feeling like their identities are being erased or diminished by this notion that somebody can just opt into a racial experience without having lived it.
Their voices are so incredibly important in this conversation. They speak to a very real sense of betrayal and invalidation.
Right.
Imagine growing up as a transracial adoptee, navigating this complex racial identity, only to have someone come along and say, oh, I can just choose to be your race, but without any of the challenges or baggage you've carried your entire life.
It's like they're saying all the struggles and the triumphs of your community are just a costume that they can put on and take off whenever they want.
And that sense of appropriation cuts so deep. It goes beyond individual feelings. It taps into a long and really painful history of cultural theft and exploitation.
So are we saying that, like, while gender identity has become more widely accepted and understood as being potentially fluid, racial identity is still much more fixed and tied to your ancestry?
It's not about saying that one is right or wrong.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the nuances of these different aspects of identity and understanding why they spark such passionate debate. The pushback against transracialism really comes from this deeply rooted understanding that race is not simply a matter of personal preference.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging a shared history, a collective experience, and this struggle for equality that still continues today.
And that struggle is something that somebody outside of that community can never truly grasp, no matter how much they study or identify with a particular culture.
Exactly. It's about respecting the boundaries of identity.
Right.
And recognizing that certain aspects of who we are shaped by forces that are beyond our individual choices.
That makes me think about that quote from the Wikipedia entry on race again. It said, "The linkage between physical traits and the concept of race is a social distinction, not an inherently biological one." So it really highlights how much of what we understand as race is actually a social construct and not this immutable biological fact.
Exactly. And that's why these arguments for and against transracialism are so complex.
Right.
On the one hand, if race is a social construct, why shouldn't someone be able to identify with a race that's different from their ancestry?
Right.
But on the other hand, as we've been talking about, reducing race to just a choice ignores the very real social and historical implications that are tied to it.
Right. It's like that TikTok video that we were talking about earlier.
Oh, right.
Where the creator breaks down race into these really super simplified categories based solely on physical characteristics.
Yeah. Right.
It completely ignores the depth and complexity of racial identity.
Yeah. Right. And that kind of simplistic view is exactly what a lot of scholars and activists, and especially those from marginalized communities, are pushing back against. It's just such a dangerous oversimplification that really fails to acknowledge the historical and social weight that comes with belonging to a particular race.
Thinking back to Dolezal, it's interesting that her Wikipedia entry mentions how some people will actually self-identify with a certain race for political reasons.
Oh, wow.
Could that be a factor in some cases of transracialism, this desire to align yourself with a particular cause or movement?
It's certainly possible. Identity is complex, and the motivations behind someone's self-identification can be multi-layered.
Right.
But again, we have to be so careful about simplifying or dismissing the experiences of people who see transracialism as this form of cultural theft.
There's a lot to unpack, and I imagine our listeners have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Kind of swirling around their heads right now.
I'm sure they do, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there are no easy answers here. This is a really nuanced and evolving conversation.
Yeah.
And it's crucial that we approach it with sensitivity, intellectual honesty, and just this willingness to listen to diverse perspectives.
And speaking of different perspectives, that YouTube video by Professor Dave Explains offers a really interesting take on transgender identity.
Yeah.
He emphasizes that being transgender is about this biological, neurochemical sense of gender that's distinct from your biological sex.
Oh, interesting.
So this is where the analogy between transgender and transracial often breaks down.
Yeah.
Well, transgender identity is increasingly understood as being rooted in biology. Proponents of transracialism argue that race is solely a social construct.
Right.
And therefore, somebody can identify with a race different from their ancestry.
Right.
But then critics argue that it's a false equivalence, that race carries this weight of history and lived experience that can't just be adopted.
Right.
It's not just about how you feel. It's about acknowledging the struggles and triumphs of an entire community.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of transracialism becomes so problematic. It risks minimizing the very real impact of race and racism,
Right.
turning it into something that can be chosen or discarded at will.
Okay, so where does all of this leave us?
Yeah.
We explored the complexities of ethnicity and race. We dove into all the controversy surrounding transracialism and looked at all the arguments against it, especially from transracial adoptees. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And I think one of the biggest takeaways here is that this whole debate really forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and about society.
Right.
It challenges all of our assumptions about identity and belonging and really the very nature of race in a world that's still, dealing with the legacy of colonialism and racial injustice.
Yeah, it feels like we're at this weird crossroads. On one hand, we're embracing this more fluid understanding of gender identity, recognizing that it's not always tied to biological sex. But then on the other hand, the idea of applying that same fluidity to race sparks just this intense debate and even outrage.
Right. And that's where this concept of woke culture comes in, which we touched on a bit earlier.
Yeah.
That Critical Drinker After Hours video defines woke as this heightened awareness of social justice issues, which sounds positive on the surface.
Right, right.
But then he goes on to point out how critics argue that woke ideology can go too far, leading to this forced diversity and misrepresentation.
Yeah.
He uses some examples like casting choices in films where it seems like historical accuracy is sacrificed just for the sake of representation.
Right, and that's exactly how critics see transracialism,
Yeah.
right? As rogue ideology gone wrong.
Yeah.
They say that it ignores the historical and social realities of race, and it turns it into something that can be put on and taken off like a costume.
Right. It's like saying I can choose to be any race I want, regardless of my ancestry or my lived experience. And that's incredibly disrespectful to people who have actually lived with, the joys and the burdens of belonging to that specific racial group.
Right. And so this brings us back to that core question that's been weaving its way through this entire deep dive. Can someone truly choose their race?
Yeah.
Is it just a matter of personal identification, or is it something much deeper rooted in ancestry, shared history, lived experience?
It's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, and there's no easy answer, is there?
Not at all. And I think that's what makes this conversation so important.
Right.
We need to be willing to engage with all of the complexities, listen to all different perspectives and challenge our own assumptions.
Absolutely. And while there might not be a right or wrong answer here, I think the important thing is to approach this topic with empathy and understanding.
Yeah.
And a deep respect for the experiences of people who have been historically marginalized and continue to face racism and discrimination.
Well said. It's about recognizing that identity is complex and there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
But it's also about acknowledging the very real harm that can be caused by trivializing or appropriating the experiences of others.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. If, as Professor Dave explains in his video, transgender is a recognized identity based on a biological sense of gender, can transracial ever be a valid identity based on a social or cultural sense of belonging to a different race?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that's going to continue to spark debate and reflection for a long time to come.
For sure.
As we've seen, there are really strong arguments on both sides.
Right.
And ultimately, it's up to each individual to grapple with these complexities and come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, but no matter where you stand on this issue, I think the key takeaway is this engaging in thoughtful dialogue, listening to different perspectives and approaching these conversations with sensitivity and respect is so crucial as we navigate this ever-evolving landscape of identity in the 21st century.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those questions until next time. Keep those brains buzzing and remember the deep dive never ends.